Ryan Bennett leaned back in the courtroom chair, smug, certain the judge was seconds away from handing him everything: the house, the money, even the last shred of Claire's dignity. Across the room, Claire Bennett sat alone in a simple navy dress, silent while whispers spread through the gallery. Ryan smirked and muttered that she had no one left in this world. Then the heavy courtroom doors swung open. Every head turned. A tall man in a tailored black suit stepped inside, calm as midnight, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor. The clerk whispered his name: Julian Ashford, the billionaire. He walked straight to Claire, took her hand, and Ryan's smile vanished as the judge looked up and said, "Mr. Ashford, you're just in time." Ryan Bennett thought today would be the easiest victory of his life. The courtroom in downtown Chicago carried the quiet tension of polished marble, muted whispers, and the faint scent of expensive cologne drifting through the rows of dark wooden benches. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, stretching pale bars of light across the floor like silent witnesses. Ryan sat at the plaintiff's table in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture relaxed, almost bored, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the judge stepped into the room. To him, this wasn't a battle. It was paperwork, a formality. Across the aisle sat Claire Bennett, the woman who had once shared his last name with pride. Now she looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a simple navy dress with no jewelry, no visible sign of the life she used to have. Her blonde hair was pulled back neatly, and her hands rested quietly in her lap as though she had already accepted defeat. Around them, the quiet murmur of spectators rippled through the courtroom. Lawyers shuffled folders. A clerk tapped lightly at a keyboard. Somewhere near the back, someone coughed softly. Ryan glanced sideways toward Claire and felt a flicker of satisfaction spread through his chest. This was exactly how he had imagined it. After months of legal maneuvering, carefully prepared statements, and the relentless work of one of Chicago's most aggressive law firms, the narrative had been shaped perfectly. Claire had been painted as the unstable spouse, the one who couldn't keep up with the demands of his fast-moving career, the woman who had drifted through their marriage without direction while he built something real. Ryan leaned slightly toward his attorney, lowering his voice. "She looks like she already knows she lost." His lawyer gave a brief, professional smile, the kind that carried quiet confidence. Because in Ryan's mind, there was no doubt left. The house on Lakeshore Drive, the financial accounts, even the public perception of who had been right and who had been wrong. He had secured all of it. A few feet away, Claire heard the whisper but didn't react. She didn't shift in her chair. She didn't look in Ryan's direction. Instead, her eyes moved slowly toward the tall double doors at the back of the courtroom. For a moment, they lingered there, calm and unreadable, as though she were waiting for something no one else in the room knew about. Ryan followed her gaze briefly and almost laughed. The hallway beyond the doors stood empty, washed in soft afternoon light. No one was coming. No dramatic rescue. No sudden reversal. Just the quiet end of a marriage that had once promised forever. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice steady as he called the room to order. Chairs creaked softly as people straightened. The judge settled behind the bench, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the documents in front of him. Ryan folded his hands confidently on the table, already imagining the headlines that would quietly confirm what everyone expected. Claire Bennett had nothing left. But as the judge began to speak, Claire's gaze never left the courtroom doors, and somewhere deep in the hallway beyond them, the sound of slow approaching footsteps echoed faintly against the marble floor. The judge adjusted the stack of documents on the bench, the soft rustle of paper echoing faintly through the quiet courtroom as every person in the room leaned into the moment. Ryan Bennett sat comfortably in his chair, fingers loosely intertwined, the faint reflection of the overhead lights gliding across the polished surface of the table in front of him. To anyone watching, he looked like a man already celebrating a victory that had simply not yet been spoken aloud. The months leading up to this morning had unfolded exactly as he planned. After the separation, Ryan had moved quickly, guided by attorneys who understood how to shape a story inside a courtroom. The narrative they presented was clean and convincing. Ryan Bennett was the successful entrepreneur, whose demanding schedule had carried the weight of their marriage, while Claire Bennett had slowly withdrawn into a quiet life that offered little support to his growing career. The documents told a simple version of the story: financial statements, property records, statements from associates who described Ryan as disciplined and focused. Piece by piece, the image formed of a man who had built everything with his own determination. Claire had never tried to publicly challenge that story. After the divorce filing 2 years earlier, she had vanished from the social circles that once surrounded them. The gallery openings, charity dinners, and rooftop celebrations overlooking the Chicago skyline had continued without her. At first, people whispered questions about where she had gone. Eventually, the whispers faded. In a city that moved as quickly as Chicago, silence could erase a person faster than any scandal. Ryan had convinced himself that Claire had simply retreated into a smaller life somewhere outside the city. Perhaps teaching art classes or helping in some quiet bookstore where no one remembered the Bennett name. The thought had once amused him. Now it simply confirmed what he believed all along. She had never been strong enough to survive the world he lived in. The judge began reviewing the final property division summary, his voice steady as he outlined the remaining matters before the ruling could be finalized. Ryan listened with a calm confidence, occasionally exchanging a quiet word with his attorney. From his perspective, the courtroom felt almost comfortable, like a boardroom where negotiations were already finished. Claire, however, remained still in her seat, her expression composed in a way that felt strangely detached from the tension surrounding her. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the tall windows where pale sunlight spilled across the floor, illuminating small floating particles of dust that moved slowly in the warm air. For a moment she closed her eyes, and in that brief silence a different memory passed through her mind. A small art gallery on a quiet street nearly 3 miles from the busy downtown district. The scent of fresh paint on canvas. Soft jazz music drifting through the open doorway on a warm summer afternoon. That was where she had met Julian Ashford. At the time, he had not introduced himself as a billionaire or a technology investor whose companies shaped entire industries. He had simply stood in front of a painting longer than anyone else in the room, studying the brushstrokes with quiet curiosity. When he finally spoke, his voice had carried the calm confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his worth to anyone. He asked Claire a single question about the painting, and the conversation that followed had changed the course of her life in ways Ryan Bennett could never imagine. Back in the courtroom, the judge turned another page, preparing to move toward the final statements. Ryan leaned slightly forward in his chair, the faint smile returning to his face. Across the aisle, Claire opened her eyes again and looked once more toward the courtroom doors as the distant sound of approaching footsteps grew a little clearer in the quiet hallway outside. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew clearer with every passing second, firm and unhurried against the polished marble floor outside the courtroom doors. Inside the room, no one seemed to notice at first. The judge continued reviewing the final page of the property division summary, his voice calm and measured as he spoke through the legal language that would soon decide the fate of everything Ryan Bennett once shared with Claire. Ryan sat forward slightly, his attention fixed on the judge, already imagining the moment when the final ruling would confirm what he had believed for months. Across the aisle, Claire Bennett remained still, her posture composed, her gaze quietly fixed on the tall wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. The faint echo of footsteps reached the hallway just beyond them. Then the doors opened. The heavy panels moved slowly inward with a soft creak that immediately drew the attention of several people seated near the back row. A ripple of curiosity spread through the gallery as heads turned. The man who stepped inside carried himself with a calm confidence that did not demand attention, but somehow commanded it anyway. He was tall, dressed in a dark tailored suit that fit with quiet precision, his expression steady and composed as his eyes scanned the room. The bailiff glanced up briefly, recognizing him almost instantly, and straightened his posture without realizing he had done so. Ryan Bennett followed the shift in attention and turned in his chair to see what had caused the sudden distraction. At first, he simply saw a stranger walking down the center aisle. Then recognition flickered across the faces of several attorneys seated along the benches. One of them leaned toward another and whispered 2 words that traveled through the quiet courtroom like a current through water. Julian Ashford. The name alone carried weight. In Chicago, Julian Ashford was not simply another wealthy investor. He was the founder of Ashford Technologies, a company that had transformed entire industries in less than a decade. His quiet reputation for strategic brilliance had earned him influence in boardrooms across the country, and his appearances in public were rare enough that even seasoned lawyers glanced up when he entered a room. Ryan felt a brief tightening in his chest, though he quickly dismissed it. Whatever business Ashford had in the courthouse could not possibly involve him. Julian continued walking forward, his measured steps echoing softly across the marble floor until he reached the center of the courtroom. Then he stopped beside the empty chair next to Claire Bennett. For the first time since the hearing began, Claire turned her head slightly. Their eyes met, and the calm expression she had carried all morning softened into the faintest smile. Julian inclined his head gently, as if apologizing for arriving later than planned, before placing a steady hand over hers on the table. The gesture was quiet, natural, and unmistakably familiar. A murmur spread through the gallery as people tried to understand what they were seeing. Ryan stared across the aisle, confusion slowly replacing the confidence that had filled him moments earlier. His attorney leaned forward, whispering urgently as the judge looked up from the bench with visible surprise. The judge adjusted his glasses and studied the man now standing beside Claire. "Mr. Ashford," the judge said slowly, his voice carrying across the room, "I was not aware you would be attending this hearing." Julian Ashford offered a polite nod. "I apologize for the late arrival, Your Honor. This matter concerns my wife, and I felt it was important to be present." The words settled into the courtroom like a sudden shift in gravity. Ryan Bennett felt the air leave his lungs as the meaning of it unfolded in his mind, and for the first time since the proceedings began, he realized that the story he believed he controlled had just changed completely. The word wife hung in the courtroom air like a bell that had just been struck, its echo spreading through every corner of the silent room. For a long moment no one moved. The judge remained still behind the bench, his glasses lowered slightly on the bridge of his nose as he studied the man standing beside Claire Bennett. A quiet wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery seats as people leaned toward one another, whispering in disbelief. Ryan Bennett felt the shift immediately, though he could not yet fully understand it. Just minutes earlier the room had belonged to him. Every document, every argument, every confident glance from his attorney had reinforced the same simple truth. He was about to win. Now that certainty seemed to dissolve beneath the steady presence of the man standing across the aisle. Ryan stared at Julian Ashford, the name echoing inside his mind with a growing sense of unease. In the world Ryan moved through, Julian Ashford was not simply wealthy. He was the kind of figure whose decisions shaped entire industries. Ashford Technologies had offices in cities Ryan had only visited during short business trips. Investors followed his strategies. Journalists wrote entire columns trying to predict his next move. And yet here he was, standing beside Claire as if this courtroom were the only place he intended to be today. Ryan's attorney leaned closer to him, his voice lowered into a tight whisper. "Did you know about this?" Ryan shook his head slowly, his eyes still locked on the pair across the room. The answer was obvious. If Claire had married someone like Julian Ashford, the news would have traveled through every business circle in Chicago within hours. There would have been headlines, speculation, conversations at every dinner table where influence mattered. But there had been nothing. Claire had disappeared after the divorce filing 2 years earlier and remained invisible ever since. Until now. Across the aisle Claire sat quietly while Julian took the seat beside her. His hand remained gently over hers on the table, the gesture steady and reassuring. To an outside observer it might have seemed like a small detail, but Claire felt the calm strength behind it immediately. It reminded her of the first afternoon they met in that quiet gallery nearly 3 miles from downtown Chicago. She had been explaining the story behind a painting when Julian listened with a level of attention she had not experienced in years. He had not interrupted. He had not corrected her. He had simply listened, then asked thoughtful questions that revealed he saw more in her than anyone else had bothered to notice. That moment had been the beginning of everything. Back in the courtroom the judge cleared his throat softly, restoring order as the murmurs faded. "Mr. Ashford," he said carefully, "this hearing concerns the division of property and financial obligations following the Bennett divorce. May I ask what role you intend to play in these proceedings?" Julian Ashford remained composed as he spoke, his voice calm and respectful. "Your Honor, I am here because the financial picture presented in this case is incomplete. The words landed with quiet precision. Ryan felt his pulse begin to quicken. His attorney straightened immediately, sensing the shift before the meaning had even fully surfaced. Julian continued, his gaze moving briefly toward Ryan before returning to the judge. Several of the assets currently under dispute were transferred into new investment structures over the past year. Structures that now include my firm. The courtroom fell silent again. The confidence Ryan had carried all morning began to fracture piece by piece as a realization slowly formed in his mind. Somewhere during the past 2 years, while he believed Claire had faded into obscurity, she had not disappeared at all. She had simply stepped into a world far more powerful than the one he thought he controlled. Ryan Bennett felt the quiet in the courtroom change in a way he could not control. Just minutes earlier, the air had carried the comfortable rhythm of a routine legal hearing. But now every person in the room seemed to be waiting for the next sentence from Julian Ashford. Ryan shifted slightly in his chair, trying to maintain the confident posture he had carried all morning, yet the certainty behind it was beginning to weaken. His attorney leaned forward quickly, adjusting his glasses while flipping through the thick folder of documents spread across the table. "Your Honor," the attorney said carefully, his voice measured but noticeably more cautious than before. The assets under discussion were clearly documented during the discovery process. My client provided full financial disclosures as required. The judge nodded slowly, but his attention remained on Julian. "Mr. Ashford," the judge replied, "are you suggesting that these disclosures are incomplete?" Julian Ashford remained calm, his expression steady as if the tension in the room barely touched him. He reached into the slim leather folder he had carried with him and placed several documents gently on the table before speaking again. "Your Honor, the disclosures were accurate at the time they were filed," he said. "However, the financial landscape surrounding those assets has changed significantly over the past 12 months. A faint murmur moved through the gallery again as people leaned forward in their seats. Ryan felt his jaw tighten. He glanced toward his attorney, searching for reassurance, but the attorney's expression had shifted into the focused concentration of someone encountering an unexpected complication. Julian continued with the same quiet composure. "Over the past year, my firm, Ashford Capital Holdings, acquired controlling interests in several investment structures connected to the properties currently listed in this case." The judge's brows lifted slightly. "Including the Lakeshore Drive property?" he asked. Julian inclined his head once. "Yes, Your Honor." Ryan felt a sudden pressure building in his chest as the meaning of those words settled into place. The house on Lakeshore Drive had been the centerpiece of the entire dispute. It was the property his legal team had fought hardest to secure. The residence overlooking the water, with its glass walls and sweeping views of the Chicago skyline, represented not only financial value but the image of success Ryan had worked so carefully to maintain. His attorney flipped another page rapidly. "That property belongs to Mr. Bennett," he insisted. "The purchase agreement was finalized 3 years ago." Julian nodded calmly. "That was correct at the time. But the investment group that holds the mortgage and equity structure for that property was acquired by Ashford Capital last spring." The courtroom became so quiet that even the faint hum of the building's air system seemed louder. Ryan stared at Julian in disbelief, trying to process what he was hearing. "Are you saying you own my house?" Ryan asked before he could stop himself. The question slipped out louder than he intended, drawing a quick glance from the judge. Julian did not react to the outburst. He simply turned his head slightly toward Ryan, his expression composed but firm. "No, Mr. Bennett," he said evenly. "I am saying the company that controls the financial structure surrounding that property now answers to me." Ryan's attorney immediately stood, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, this development has never been presented during negotiations." The judge leaned back in his chair, considering the implications carefully. Across the aisle, Claire Bennett remained calm, her hand still resting beneath Julian's steady grip. She watched Ryan with quiet eyes that carried neither anger nor triumph. Only a calm certainty that the story unfolding inside this courtroom was finally revealing the truth Ryan had never bothered to see. Ryan Bennett felt the weight of the room pressing down around him as the meaning of Julian Ashford's words settled deeper into the silence. The polished courtroom that had felt so familiar earlier now seemed strangely unfamiliar. as if the ground beneath his carefully prepared case had begun to shift inch by inch. Ryan straightened his posture, forcing his shoulders back as he tried to recover the confidence that had guided him through months of preparation. Across the aisle, Julian Ashford remained calm, his presence steady beside Claire Bennett as though none of this tension was unexpected. The judge studied the documents that Julian had placed on the table, slowly turning the pages while the quiet rustle of paper echoed through the chamber. These documents indicate that Ashford Capital Holdings acquired majority positions in several financial vehicles connected to the Bennett property portfolio, the judge said thoughtfully. Ryan's attorney leaned forward again, his voice now carrying a more urgent edge. Your Honor, even if Mr. Ashford's firm holds certain financial interests, that does not change the ownership structure established under Mr. Bennett's name. Julian listened without interruption. When the attorney finished speaking, Julian simply rested his hands on the table and replied with the same calm tone that had unsettled the room since his arrival. Ownership is rarely as simple as a name on a deed, he said quietly. In modern real estate structures, control is determined by the entities that carry the financing and equity leverage behind those deeds. Ryan felt the muscles in his jaw tighten again. The words sounded technical, almost distant, but he understood their implications clearly enough. Over the past several years, he had relied heavily on complex financing arrangements to expand his investments. The strategy had allowed him to purchase properties that appeared fully under his control, while much of the financial structure remained layered within investment groups and lenders. It had been a calculated risk, one that had worked perfectly until now. The judge glanced back toward Ryan. Mr. Bennett, were you aware of the transfer of these investment groups to Ashford Capital? Ryan hesitated, the answer forming reluctantly in his throat. No, Your Honor, he admitted. A faint shift of movement spread through the gallery again as the spectators absorbed the tension unfolding before them. Claire remained still beside Julian, her expression calm as she watched Ryan struggle to keep his composure. For the first time since the hearing began, Ryan realized that she was no longer the quiet figure he remembered from the end of their marriage. Something about her had changed. The uncertainty that once surrounded her had been replaced by a quiet confidence that did not need to prove itself. The judge leaned back slightly, considering the situation with careful patience. If Mr. Ashford's firm now controls these financial structures, he said slowly, then the property valuations presented during this hearing may require further review. Ryan's attorney immediately protested. Your Honor, delaying the ruling would be highly irregular after this stage of the proceedings. Julian did not raise his voice. He simply met the judge's gaze with quiet certainty. Your Honor, my intention is not to delay the process, he said, only to ensure that the court understands the full financial reality before reaching its final decision. Ryan felt a cold realization forming in his mind as he looked across the room. The case he believed was already finished had suddenly reopened in ways he had never anticipated. And as he watched Julian Ashford sit calmly beside Claire, Ryan began to understand that the life Claire had built during the past 2 years was far more powerful than anything he had imagined. The courtroom remained suspended in a quiet tension that seemed to stretch across every polished surface and wooden bench. Ryan Bennett felt the steady confidence he had carried into the building that morning slipping further from his grasp with every passing second. The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the newly presented documents once more, his expression thoughtful as he examined the financial structures connected to the properties listed in the case. Ryan sat rigidly beside his attorney, his eyes shifting between the judge and Julian Ashford as though trying to measure a threat he could not yet fully understand. For years, Ryan had built his reputation on the belief that control meant anticipation. He studied markets before they moved, predicted negotiations before they began, and shaped outcomes long before his competitors realized what had happened. Yet this moment felt different. This was not a market fluctuation or a business rival. This was something far more personal. Across the aisle, Claire Bennett sat with quiet composure beside Julian, her posture relaxed but steady, as though the unfolding tension around her no longer carried the weight it once might have. Ryan remembered a different version of Claire, one who would have shrunk beneath the attention of an entire courtroom, someone who avoided confrontation and retreated whenever his voice carried too much certainty. The woman sitting across from him now did not look like that person anymore. Her calm seemed rooted in something deeper than simple confidence. It carried the quiet assurance of someone who already knew the direction the story was moving. The judge placed the final page of the documents down on the bench and folded his hands together. "Mr. Ashford," he said carefully, "these financial structures are significantly more complex than what was originally presented to this court. It appears that several of the properties connected to Mr. Bennett's portfolio are now partially controlled through entities that fall under your firm." Julian nodded once in acknowledgement. "That is correct, Your Honor." Ryan's attorney rose quickly, attempting to regain control of the hearing before the situation shifted any further. "Your Honor, these corporate acquisitions occurred outside the scope of the original divorce filing. They should not influence the court's determination of the existing marital property division." Julian turned his gaze toward the attorney, his expression polite but unwavering. "Respectfully," he replied, "the valuation of those properties is directly tied to the entities that now finance them. Without acknowledging that change, the financial representation before this court would remain incomplete." The judge considered this in silence. Ryan felt the pressure building in his chest again as the room waited for the judge's response. Every instinct in him urged him to interrupt, to push back, to reclaim the confident narrative that had guided him here. But something about Julian Ashford's presence made that impossible. The man spoke without raising his voice, yet each sentence seemed to shift the ground beneath Ryan's carefully prepared arguments. The judge finally looked toward Claire. "Mrs. Ashford," he said slowly, acknowledging her for the first time since Julian's arrival, "were you aware of these acquisitions?" Claire lifted her gaze calmly, meeting the judge's eyes with quiet respect. "Yes, Your Honor," she answered. Her voice was steady, clear, and completely free of hesitation. Ryan felt the room tilt slightly in that moment. "Mrs. Ashford." The name echoed through his thoughts with a strange finality. The woman he once believed had disappeared into a smaller life had quietly stepped into an entirely different world, one connected to a man whose influence extended far beyond the reach of Ryan's own ambitions. And as Ryan looked across the courtroom at Claire and Julian sitting together with calm certainty, he began to realize that the outcome he believed was inevitable was no longer guaranteed at all. The courtroom remained frozen in a quiet tension that felt heavier than the thick marble walls surrounding it. Ryan Bennett could feel the shift in the atmosphere as clearly as if the air itself had changed. Just minutes earlier he had believed he understood every moving piece of this hearing. Now the pieces were rearranging themselves in ways he had never anticipated. The judge looked down once more at the documents spread across the bench, the pages reflecting the pale light coming through the tall windows behind him. For several seconds he said nothing, allowing the silence to settle over the room like a slow gathering storm. Ryan glanced toward his attorney again, hoping for the reassuring confidence that had guided them through months of preparation. Instead, he saw something different. Careful calculation. The kind of expression lawyers wear when a strategy suddenly requires rewriting. Across the aisle, Julian Ashford remained composed, his posture relaxed yet attentive. He did not appear interested in dominating the moment. In fact, he seemed almost patient, as though he had expected every question that was now unfolding. Beside him, Claire Bennett sat quietly, her hands resting calmly on the table. For the first time, Ryan noticed something he had overlooked earlier. There was no tension in her shoulders, no sign of anxiety. The woman he once believed he understood completely now carried herself with the steady calm of someone who had already moved far beyond the conflict unfolding around her. The judge finally lifted his eyes from the documents. "Mrs. Ashford," he said carefully, "you indicated that you were aware of these acquisitions. When did you first become involved in these financial arrangements?" Claire's gaze remained steady as she answered. "Approximately 14 months ago, Your Honor." Ryan felt a flicker of disbelief. 14 months. That timeline placed the beginning of these changes well before the final stages of the divorce negotiations. The judge continued. "Were these acquisitions connected to any intention of influencing the outcome of this proceeding?" Claire shook her head gently. "No, Your Honor. At the time the investments were made, this hearing had not yet been scheduled." Julian remained silent beside her, allowing Claire's voice to carry the explanation. The judge nodded thoughtfully and turned his attention back toward Ryan. "Mr. Bennett," he said, It appears that several of the financial structures connected to your property holdings have evolved during the past year. This development raises important questions regarding valuation and ownership influence. Ryan felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward him. For the first time that morning, he struggled to find the right response. "Your Honor," he began slowly, "those acquisitions were made by outside investors. They were not part of my direct control." Julian's calm voice entered the silence before the judge could reply. "That is precisely the point, Your Honor." Ryan turned sharply toward him, frustration rising beneath his carefully controlled composure. Julian did not raise his voice or change his posture. Modern investment structures rarely rely on direct ownership alone. Control often lies with the institutions that provide the financial framework beneath those assets. The statement carried no accusation, yet the implications settled heavily in the room. Ryan realized that the strategy he had used for years, building leverage through layered financing, had quietly placed portions of his empire into the hands of investors whose interests could shift without warning. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, considering the broader implications of what he was hearing. "If Mr. Ashford's firm now holds influence within these structures," he said slowly, "then the court must examine how that influence affects the division of marital assets presented here today." Ryan felt the quiet certainty he once carried slipping further away. Across the aisle, Claire met his gaze briefly. There was no bitterness in her expression, no triumph. Only a calm understanding that the story Ryan believed he controlled had reached a turning point he could no longer ignore. Ryan Bennett felt the quiet in the courtroom deepen into something heavier, something that no longer resembled the orderly legal proceeding he had walked into earlier that morning. The polished marble floors and tall windows had not changed, yet the atmosphere inside the room had shifted in a way that made every breath feel slower and more deliberate. The judge rested his hands together on the bench while reviewing the documents once more, the faint sound of paper sliding against wood echoing softly through the chamber. For several seconds no one spoke. Ryan sat rigidly beside his attorney, his mind racing through the layers of financial structures he had spent years building. Those structures had always been his advantage. They allowed him to move quickly, to acquire properties and investments with leverage that multiplied his reach. It had always felt like control. Now that same complexity was slowly turning into uncertainty. His attorney leaned closer again, whispering quietly as he pointed toward one of the documents Julian Ashford had provided. Ryan nodded slowly, though the reassurance he expected did not come. Across the aisle, Julian remained composed, his attention directed toward the judge with the calm patience of someone who had navigated rooms like this many times before. Claire Bennett sat beside him with the same steady composure she had carried since the hearing began. Ryan studied her again, still struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the version of Claire he remembered from the final months of their marriage. Back then she had seemed uncertain, overwhelmed by the pace of the world Ryan insisted they live in. Now there was nothing uncertain in her presence. The judge finally cleared his throat gently, drawing the room back to attention. "The court must consider the current financial realities surrounding these assets," he said slowly. "If Ashford Capital Holdings now holds significant influence within the investment structures tied to these properties, then the valuation presented earlier may no longer represent the full picture." Ryan's attorney rose again, careful but firm. "Your Honor, the acquisitions mentioned today occurred through standard market transactions. They should not alter the legal ownership already established under Mr. Bennett." Julian listened without interruption, then spoke in the same calm tone that had gradually reshaped the entire hearing. "Ownership and influence are not always identical concepts, Your Honor, but they often determine who truly benefits from an asset over time." The judge studied him for a moment. "Are you suggesting that these investment changes could affect the financial outcome of this divorce settlement?" Julian paused briefly before answering. "Yes, Your Honor, because the long-term value of these properties now depends on the strategic decisions made by my firm." Ryan felt the words settle like a slow realization spreading through his mind. The empire he believed he had built entirely on his own was more interconnected than he had ever admitted. Lenders, investors, and silent partners all existed beneath the surface. And now the most powerful of those partners sat calmly across the aisle beside Claire. The judge leaned back in his chair again, clearly weighing the implications. Then it would appear, he said carefully, that the court must review how these financial relationships influenced the equitable distribution of assets between the parties. Ryan stared forward, the quiet certainty he carried into the courtroom now completely gone. Across the aisle, Claire met his gaze briefly once more. Her expression remained calm, almost reflective, as though she had already accepted whatever outcome would come next. And for the first time since the hearing began, Ryan understood that the story he believed was ending in his victory was only now revealing its true direction. Ryan Bennett sat motionless as the quiet weight of the courtroom settled deeper around him. The faint hum of the ventilation system above and the distant murmur of traffic outside the courthouse windows were suddenly the only sounds filling the pause that followed the judge's last words. For years, Ryan had thrived in rooms where negotiation, pressure, and confidence shaped every outcome. But this moment felt different. The sense of control he once carried had slipped away piece by piece, replaced by the growing realization that the landscape beneath his carefully built empire had shifted without his knowledge. The judge adjusted the stack of documents again, studying them with deliberate patience before lifting his gaze toward the two tables facing him. Given the new information presented today, he said slowly, the court must carefully reconsider how these financial structures affect the equitable division of assets between the parties. Ryan's attorney rose once more, attempting to steady the momentum that had clearly moved away from them. Your Honor, while the involvement of Ashford Capital Holdings may influence the broader investment landscape, the property titles themselves remain under Mr. Bennett's name. The court should focus on the ownership defined in the existing records. The judge listened without interrupting, then turned his attention toward Julian Ashford. Julian remained composed, his hands resting calmly on the table beside Claire Bennett. Your Honor, he said in the same quiet tone that had reshaped the entire hearing since his arrival. This situation is not about changing the court's authority. It is about ensuring that the court understands the full structure surrounding these assets before reaching its final decision. The judge nodded slightly. Explain. Julian inclined his head respectfully. The financial instruments connected to these properties now operate under investment agreements managed by my firm. The long-term value and stability of those assets depend heavily on the decisions made by Ashford Capital Holdings. Ryan felt the tension tightening in his chest again. He understood exactly what Julian was implying. The properties might still carry Ryan's name on paper, but their financial lifelines were no longer entirely his to command. If the institutions behind those investments shifted their priorities, the foundation beneath his holdings could change rapidly. The judge leaned back thoughtfully, considering the broader implications. If the financial leverage behind these assets is now tied to Ashford Capital, he said slowly, then the court must evaluate whether the original valuation presented during this hearing still represents an accurate assessment of the marital estate. The words landed with quiet finality. Ryan's attorney lowered himself back into his chair, flipping through the documents again with a growing sense of urgency. Across the aisle, Claire Bennett remained calm, her gaze resting briefly on Ryan before returning to the judge. There was no hostility in her expression, no desire for public triumph. Instead, there was a quiet certainty that felt stronger than any argument raised during the hearing. The judge finally folded his hands together again. The court will require additional review of the financial structures presented today, he announced. Until that review is completed, a final ruling on the division of these assets will be temporarily withheld. The decision hung in the air like the closing note of a long and complicated performance. Ryan felt the last fragments of his earlier confidence dissolve completely. Across the room, Julian Ashford sat beside Claire with the same calm presence he had carried from the moment he walked through the courtroom doors. And as Ryan looked at them together, he finally understood that the quiet transformation Claire had undergone during the past 2 years had rewritten a story he once believed he controlled from beginning to end. The quiet declaration from the judge lingered in the air long after the words were spoken, as if the entire courtroom needed time to absorb the shift that had just taken place. Ryan Bennett remained seated, his hands resting on the edge of the polished wooden table while the realization slowly settled in his mind. Only an hour earlier he had entered the courthouse certain that the final ruling would close this chapter of his life with clean precision. Now the future of everything he believed he controlled had been placed under careful review. The judge gathered the documents before him and spoke again with measured authority. The court will schedule a continuation of this hearing once the financial structures connected to the Bennett properties have been fully examined. Until then, all disputed assets will remain temporarily unchanged. The statement carried the quiet finality of a door closing, though not in the direction Ryan had expected. His attorney leaned toward him again, speaking in a hushed voice filled with controlled urgency as he outlined the next procedural steps. Ryan listened, but the words seemed distant, as if they were unfolding in a different room entirely. His attention kept returning to the two figures seated across the aisle. Julian Ashford and Claire Bennett remained calm, their posture relaxed while the gallery slowly stirred with renewed whispers. The spectators who had gathered for what they assumed would be a routine divorce hearing were now watching something far more unexpected unfold. The bailiff announced a brief recess, and the room began to shift with the quiet sounds of chairs moving and papers being gathered. Ryan stood slowly, straightening the front of his suit jacket as though the familiar motion might restore the composure he once carried effortlessly. Across the aisle, Claire rose as well. For a moment their eyes met across the distance between the tables. Ryan searched her expression for some trace of the woman he once knew. But the person standing before him now felt entirely different. There was no bitterness in her gaze, no satisfaction at seeing his certainty unravel. Instead, there was a calm clarity that seemed to belong to someone who had already moved beyond the conflict that once defined their marriage. Julian stood beside her, his presence steady without appearing dominant. He spoke quietly with Claire for a moment before turning toward the exit at the side of the courtroom. As they began to walk, Ryan heard fragments of conversation ripple through the spectators behind him. Some whispered Julian Ashford's name with the recognition that followed powerful figures wherever they went. Others spoke Claire's new name with curiosity. Mrs. Ashford. Ryan felt the weight of that name again as it echoed through the room. The woman he once believed would always exist within the shadow of his ambition had quietly built a life connected to someone whose influence reached far beyond Ryan's own world. Near the courtroom doors, Julian paused briefly, as if sensing Ryan's gaze still following them. He turned slightly, meeting Ryan's eyes for a single calm moment. There was no hostility in his expression, only the quiet certainty of someone who understood the balance of the situation completely. Then he placed a gentle hand at the small of Claire's back and guided her toward the hallway beyond the courtroom. Ryan remained standing beside the empty table as the room slowly cleared around him. The confidence he carried into the building that morning had vanished entirely, replaced by a new and unfamiliar understanding. The story he believed had already been written had taken a direction he could never have predicted, and for the first time he realized that the quiet transformation of Claire Bennett had changed far more than the outcome of a single hearing. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than the chamber they had just left, though the faint echo of footsteps against the marble floor carried a calm rhythm that contrasted sharply with the tension Ryan Bennett still felt inside his chest. He stepped out a few moments after the others, the heavy courtroom doors closing softly behind him. The long corridor stretched toward the courthouse entrance where tall windows spilled afternoon sunlight across the polished floor. Ryan paused near the wall, adjusting his jacket as though the simple motion might restore the composure he had once carried so easily. A few attorneys passed by with polite nods, their voices low as they discussed the unexpected turn the hearing had taken. Ryan barely heard them. His attention drifted farther down the hallway where Claire Bennett and Julian Ashford had stopped near one of the tall windows overlooking the busy Chicago streets below. From a distance, they looked almost ordinary, two people standing side by side, while sunlight reflected softly across the glass behind them. Yet there was something undeniably powerful in the calm way they occupied that quiet space. Julian stood with the relaxed posture of someone who did not need to prove his authority to anyone in the room. Claire stood beside him with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the hearing. Ryan remembered a different hallway 2 years earlier, outside the office of the mediator who had first discussed the terms of their divorce. Back then, Claire had looked uncertain, overwhelmed by the legal language and financial strategies that Ryan navigated so confidently. He had believed that moment defined who she truly was, someone who would always stand just outside the center of the world he controlled. Now he understood how completely he had misjudged her. Claire turned slightly, as if sensing his presence behind them. Their eyes met across the corridor, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. Ryan noticed again that there was no anger in her expression, no desire to reopen old wounds or remind him of past mistakes. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness that seemed to belong to someone who had already moved forward long before this hearing began. Julian glanced toward Ryan as well, acknowledging him with a simple nod that carried neither challenge nor superiority. It was the calm recognition between two men who understood that the balance of power between them had quietly shifted. Ryan stepped closer, stopping several feet away as the distant sounds of the courthouse continued around them. For a moment, he searched for the right words, but found none that matched the strange clarity forming in his mind. The woman he once believed he had left behind had not disappeared at all. She had simply rebuilt her life somewhere beyond the narrow view he once held of her world. Claire finally spoke, her voice calm and measured in the quiet hallway. "Ryan, whatever happens next in court, I hope you understand something." Ryan looked at her, waiting. She paused briefly before continuing. "This was never about winning." The words carried no accusation, only the simple honesty of someone who had already made peace with the past. Ryan stood there for a moment longer as the meaning settled in. For the first time he realized that the transformation he had witnessed inside that courtroom was not a sudden surprise. It was the result of choices Claire had made quietly over time, building a life defined not by the conflict they once shared, but by the future she chose to create. And as Ryan watched Claire turn and walk beside Julian toward the courthouse exit, he understood that the most powerful change in this entire story had nothing to do with money or property at all.